Everyone, it's Stephanie, and I'm here today to do the first installment of my new series on my channel, Four of a Kind, where I talk about 4 books that have something in common, whether it be a plot element or a location. All these novels are going to be very different, but they're going to have something that holds them all together. And of course, being the kind of person that I am, I thought we should start on a high note. Just kidding, I wanted to start with something dark and depressing. So the first episode today is going to be about novels that deal with the death of a child, especially the aftermath. So in most of these novels, the death happens off screen in a way, and we are just dealing with the direct aftermath of the family trying to navigate through this grief, trying to get used to this new family dynamic that's missing a person, and how they relate to each other and how they understand each other's grieving processes. And it's something that I find really interesting in fiction. So I have 4 books for you today that talk about that. The Lovely Bones by Alice Sebold, Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng, It by Stephen King, and Ordinary People by Judith. Now these books aren't terribly different from each other. I think the one that is standing out right now is probably It by Stephen King. The other 3 are literary fiction that deal with the type of grief that I was talking about earlier. But the differences in situations in the novel can be seen really clearly. 2 of the novels deal with death of daughters, the other 2 deal with death of sons. They are all different birth orders. Susie Salmon in The Lovely Bones was the oldest. Buck Jarrett in Ordinary People was the oldest. Georgie Dunbrow in It was the youngest, and Lydia in Everything I Never Told You was the middle child. I think it's interesting what happens with time in these novels. In Ordinary People, it has been some time since their oldest son has died, and when we start the novel, it is after they've had basically another situation with their remaining son Conrad. In Everything I Never Told You, it immediately starts the morning after Lydia is dead. In fact, the first sentence is Lydia is dead, but they do not know this yet. But with The Lovely Bones and It, the novel opens up with the death of the children. In The Lovely Bones, Susie Salmon narrates how her neighbor basically lures and murders her. And what is interesting about her story is that she still remains the main character. The rest of her story, she is looking down on her family from heaven. It is told from a third-person point of view, and it does talk about, if you have seen the adaptation, I will get to adaptations later, but what scarred me as a child is the opening to It, where Georgie Dunbrow has a paper boat that he follows along, and it falls into a storm drain, and he meets Pennywise the clown, who ends up killing him, and that is the opening to the story. With It and the Dunbrow family, the Mr. and Mrs. Dunbrow are probably the most background characters in the story. His parents, basically, for the rest of the novel, and as much as we see them, which is not often, they are very emotionally unavailable. They are just stricken with grief, and a lot of this, as we later find out, is a supernatural thing that has been going on in this town. But basically, the remaining son is also being tormented by the same force that killed their younger son, and they are basically of no help. As I mentioned earlier, they are very emotionally unavailable. In The Lovely Bones, as I mentioned earlier, Susie is basically watching from heaven and watching how her family grieves, and for a lot of the book, her family doesn't have closure. They don't know what happened. There is no body. So it's that question of, how long do you wait? When do you just give up hope and say that your child is dead? When do you stop waiting for them to come home? And I thought it was interesting that it talked about the strain that can put on a marriage when the parties differ in topics of grief and moving on and letting go. And I thought it was interesting that it was also a little bit from her perspective, that she is also in heaven, not being able to move on herself or let go of her family. Instead of really being present in her heaven, she spends all of her time looking down at her family. I thought it was really interesting how they did that. The Lovely Bones is one of my favorite books. It's a book I read, I think, as a freshman in high school, and it's a book I find myself thinking about often. Ordinary People did play with the same things, the change in relationships and the strain that a loss like that and a trauma like that can put on a marriage and on a relationship, and how it affects the relationship with the remaining children in these situations where there might be blame to be thrown around. How do you live with that? And I thought it was really interesting. I think the only one of these that actually does not have an adaptation, because it is the newest, is Celeste Ng's Everything I Never Told You. But The Lovely Bones did have a movie adaptation sometime in the 2000s. I did not like it. I thought they spent way too much time on the surreal aspects of the story, and I thought not enough time with the real relationships and family tension. It didn't work for me, so I did not enjoy the movie. Ordinary People, I really enjoyed. If you haven't seen it yet, I don't know if it was made in the 70s or 80s, but it does has a very young Donald Sutherland and Mary Tyler Moore, and I think what is one of her only dramatic roles. Is really great. I definitely recommend that you watch it. And also, I had a question, because my dad said that he had to read Ordinary People for his high school. It was required reading that they had to do. I did not have that. So if you're watching this and you had to read Ordinary People in high school, if it was any kind of required reading for school, if you could let me know. I think that's really interesting. So if that applies to you, please talk to me in the comments. And of course, it had the mini-series adaptation. And while loss and grief may not be the greatest themes in it, they are present. So Stephen King's It is getting a new adaptation coming out later this year. I really hope I'll be able to see it, but everyone in my family is scaredy cats. But anyway, guys, this has been the first episode of Four of a Kind. I hope you like it. If you have any suggestions for any episodes you would like to see in the future, if you liked any of these books, if you have anything to say about any of these books, just come talk to me in the comments. I love your guys' comments. Thank you so much for watching. Hope to see you again soon. Bye!